Welcome back to the Rules Plus podcast. Today's episode is the fourth of 12 preseason episodes focused on the 12 chapters of the Rogers Reading Study Guide to NCAA Football Rules, now authored by George Demetrio. In the last three episodes, we reviewed Chapter 1 concerning the purpose and format of the Reading Study Guide, Chapter 2 concerning recent rules changes, and last week, Chapter 3 concerning the kicking game. Today's topic is Chapter 4 concerning scrimmage requirements and provisions about live ball versus dead ball. I think this topic has potential to be unsettling because we're going to be explicit about the truly extensive requirements we take for granted that teams must comply with before every snap. I should warn you that studying Chapter 4 is going to be like watching how the sausage is made. We may not want to go there, but go there we must. First, I have some postscripts, though, to Chapter 3's discussion last week. I will share these two postscripts here. First, I hope you noticed, because I didn't draw attention to it, that the Reading Study Guide treatment of the kicking game required referencing more than just Rule 6. The conversation touched on related concepts from, get this, Rules 2, 3, 5, 6, 8, 9, and 10. For example, we must go to Rule 2 for play classifications, to Rule 3 to determine what to do with the game clock when a kick play doesn't result in a breaking of the continuity of downs, and so it goes on and on. I have hammered home the necessity to consult an eclectic collection of rules sources rather than focus on individual rules silos. The Reading Study Guide's organization echoes that approach, based as it is on what it refers to as phases of the game rather than on a rule-by-rule grand tour. As you'll soon see in this episode, the same attention to eclectic rules sources to understand scrimmage requirements is also reflected in Chapter 4. Second, here's an interesting kicking game play that I just happened to see this weekend in a UFL game. It was pure serendipity that I saw the play. I'm not a fan of spring football, but I was channel surfing when I saw this. Here's the play. As a punted ball was rolling to a stop at the 1-yard line, the returner was kneeling in the end zone, prepared to recover it and take the touchback. When instead the ball stopped at the 1, the returner reached into the field, grabbed the ball with both hands, and drew it back into his chest, thinking he had secured a touchback. Consider what you should rule under NCAA rules. Is there a touchback? A safety? Team B's ball at the 20? Team B's ball at the 1? Does the momentum rule apply? I'll share my ruling now and then share the ruling made by replay for the UFL. In my view, the ball became dead on the 1-yard line either because you could rule it came to rest and no player attempted to secure it. That would be from 413F, or, I think more likely, because the returner possessed the ball while grounded, 413B. When he possessed the ball, a running play began and then instantly ended with the ball at the 1-yard line. But here's the interesting part. Apparently, UFL rules are similar to NFL rules concerning when a ball carrier is downed. According to replay, the runner was not downed by contact, so he did not make the ball dead when he possessed it. When he drew the ball back to his chest and gave himself up, only then did the ball become dead, and it did so in the end zone. Since the returner put the ball in the end zone, the result of the play was a safety. It was a wacky play for sure, and I just had to share it with you at the risk of sowing confusion. Please remember that under NCAA rules, we would not make the ruling of a safety. All right, let's move on to scrimmage kick requirements and the live ball, dead ball. There's more to this rule in this chapter than meets the eye. It's easy for us to become complacent about being attentive to the largely procedural matters that teams must attend to before the ball becomes live to start a scrimmage down. For, I think, two reasons. First, unlike with kicking downs that we discussed last week, we see a lot of scrimmage downs, perhaps 120 to 150 between both teams, with the advent of today's hurry up style and the 40-second play clock. After every dead ball, we have to reset quickly, tediously checking the same boxes before each snap, relentlessly for up to 3 hours in a mind numbing routine. How easy it is to skip a few of those boxes and to be lulled into assuming that the patterns we've seen teams develop in substitutions, formations, and shifts will continue for this next play. I find a catch-22 challenge in working scrimmage plays. While we blame the difficulty of officiating the kicking game on how few such plays we see, I'm now blaming the difficulty of officiating scrimmage requirements on how many such plays we see. Let's just say that both aspects of the game present their own set of challenges. Second reason, because scrimmage requirements embody essentially the dead ball bureaucracy of the game and not so directly the live ball action of the game, I suspect most of us harbor a subliminal, scornful disdain for what we may regard as technicalities, a disdain that coaches may all the more harbor, unless, of course, they can leverage a technicality for their team's advantage. We resent bureaucracies at work, in government, and in business. We certainly resent bureaucracy in the game, pushing us to bog things down with technicalities. We say, along with fans and coaches, let the players determine the outcome. So, best practice has it that we are advised to employ preventative officiating, which means to stretch and pull and tolerate and cajole and wink and coax and massage and manage to entice good enough compliance, with throwing a flag our last recourse. Such advice is good, very good for the game and for us, but following such advice is hard. It's so hard, in fact, since a year ago, we've had a new Part 2 section in the NCAA official rules book with explicit codified officiating standards, maxims that were previously in the mechanics manual, not in the rules book, and referred to for a long time as philosophies. It's so hard, in fact, that many rules include explicit counsel about what to do in tricky situations, counsel formerly introduced by the phrase, when in doubt, but now, in an editorial epiphany, introduced by the revised phrase, when in question. By editorial fiat, we officials are no longer ever in doubt. Rather, the objective reality of the play is in question. Considering the three sports I have officiated, I find the notion of explicitly incorporating officials' discretion into the football rules book is distinctive. In baseball, some umpires may buy into the notion that, when in doubt, they're out. In basketball, some referees may buy into the notion that, when in doubt, it's a block, not a charge. But those notions are nowhere in print. However, in the NCAA football rules book, I count 29 locations where the phrase, when in question, appears. I also see in Appendix G, which is a summary of penalties, a search query category of when in question rules. That's exactly how it is phrased in the rules book. Seriously. And in the recently adopted Part 2 addressing officiating standards, I also see 4 instances in Section 7, Other Passing Situations, where the phrase, when in question, appears. For example, in Item 1 of that section, the text reads, when in question on action against the passer, it is roughing the passer if the defender attempts to punish. In item 5, the text reads, if in question as to whether passers are or have been outside the tackle box, they are outside the tackle box. And so it goes. Well, let's move on to when in question guidance concerning scrimmage requirements. Of particular interest to us for this episode of the Rules Plus podcast is Section 2 of the Standards Provisions, to be found on page FO-2 in the Rules Book, which presents 10 prescriptions for officiating the line of scrimmage. In each of 10 situations that present an in-question moment, do the following. Rule a false start rather than illegal motion. 2. Regard offensive linemen as legally positioned. 3. Call a foul if an offensive lineman's head is clearly behind the snapper's rear end. 4. Regard as a legal formation with a slotback or wide receiver meant to be off the line. 5. Rule a tight end is not covered up if there's stagger between slotbacks or receivers' alignments. 6. Rule a defender who enters the neutral zone has threatened an offensive lineman. 7. Rule a defender aligned tight to the neutral zone who jumps forward has entered the neutral zone. 8. Rule a defender who has shot the gap has made contact and is offside. 9. Hold an offense running a trick play to the tightest scrutiny for formation legality. And 10, rule a false start for a quick or abrupt movement by the center or quarterback. You should note a pretty consistent principle behind each standard. If possible, err on the side of ruling there is no foul, except in matters of player safety. It's also worth noting that other standards regarding activity that can be reviewed by replay favor making a so-called ruling that allows a play to continue rather than being shut down immediately, such as fumbles. For this reason, since we have no replay capability for Texas high school games, you'll find that the standards published by the Texas Association of Football Officials differ in a few situations from NCAA standards. This is an important topic for us, but a topic for another episode of this podcast. So, let's go in depth on the particulars of scrimmage requirements. So even though NCAA standards, consistent with long-standing best officiating practice, counsel officials to use discretion and avoid nitpicking over scrimmage requirements, we must be expert in our knowledge of the intricacies of such requirements. It's one thing to choose to let a technical violation ride by astutely judging that the spirit of a requirement has been met. It's quite another thing to fail to call an infraction because we don't recognize it, or worse, don't know it. I find that Chapter 4 of the Reading Study Guide presents a humbling catalog of stuff I fear we don't know that we don't know, or stuff we think we know. Let's take a look. Myths and legends exposed. What we think we know. Chapter 4 covers aspects of scrimmage requirements, and we'll consider those topics in turn. 7 components of requirements for Team A, as I read it: the snapper, encroachment, false starts, shifts, formations and numbering, substitutions, and motion. And 4 components of requirements for Team B: aligning, feigning, meddling, touching the ball, or Team A players. Let's first look at 2 fundamental concepts that begin Chapter 4, types of downs and team possession. With 7 components to cover for Team A versus 4 components to cover for Team B, it's clear that Team A carries by far the greater burden to exercise scrimmage protocol. But before addressing the team-specific scrimmage requirements, Chapter 4 reviews 3 important concepts that we think we understand intuitively, but are worth clarifying nevertheless: types of downs and possession. A live ball is one that's in play, and later the chapter covers specific events that cause it to become dead. But reflect for a moment on what events put a ball in play. That's an important thing to know because that's how a down starts. And from last week's discussion of the 4 types of plays that can occur during a down, it's important to know when a down starts. So, in how many ways does a down start? This isn't a trick question. Intuition tells us there are 2 ways. A ball becomes live by means of a free kick or a snap. That's it. After a score, play resumes with a free kick. At any other time, play resumes with a snap. So there are 2 kinds of downs during which 4 kinds of plays can occur. There are free kick downs and scrimmage downs. But I lied about a trick question. There is a trick, and here it is. A down is indeed action that starts when the ball becomes live, with one notable exception that can be very important. There is a 3rd kind of down, the try. I ask you, when does a try down start? The answer, by the way, is not in Rule 2 with lots of other definitions. The answer is in Rule 8, Section 3, devoted entirely to the try down. We already know a try is, as 832 puts it, quote, a special interval in the game, end quote, that allows a team that scored a touchdown to score a 1-point place kick, a 2-point touchdown, or a 1-point safety. Some years ago, the try also became an opportunity for the scored upon team to score a 2-point touchdown off a turnover. That's special indeed. But there's one more way in which a try is special. A try down begins when the ball is signaled ready for play, not when it is snapped. This exclusive difference from free kick downs and scrimmage downs is potentially important because it chops up the dead ball interval between the scoring of the touchdown and the snap for the try down. There is the dead ball period from the scoring of the touchdown until they're ready for play, and then there is the subsequent dead ball period from the ready for play until the snap. Rule 10 provides that when fouls occur after a touchdown and before the ball is ready for play on the try, or there was a live ball foul treated as a dead ball foul during the touchdown play, the offended team may choose whether to enforce the penalty on the try, the succeeding kickoff, or the succeeding spot in extra periods. That's in 10.2.5c. However, Rule 8 provides that when there are fouls occurring after the ball is ready for play and before the snap, they are enforced before the next snap. That is an 833D1. That is, there is no option to have the foul enforced on the succeeding kickoff or the succeeding spot in extra periods. Splitting up the dead ball period costs the offended team a choice it might have wanted to exercise. Losing that option could be a big deal. Suppose after a touchdown and after the ready for play for the try, a frustrated Team B player taunts a Team A player, or perhaps a Team B lineman anticipating the snap, tees off on a Team A lineman. Team B only suffers a loss of 1.5 yards. Contrast that disappointing scenario with this instructive scenario from approved ruling 323, play Roman 5. Quote, Team A scores a touchdown during a down in which time expires. After the touchdown, but before the try, either team fouls. Ruling, the period is extended only for the try. The penalty may be enforced on the try or the succeeding kickoff or the succeeding spot in extra periods. End quote. Probably only a really smart coach or player, or a really frustrated coach or player, is aware of the rare opportunity this presents in the earlier scenario to release frustration or retaliate without a prospect of a significant penalty. But the quirk of this rule makes it possible nevertheless. we should be attentive. Concerning team possession, Chapter 4 reminds us that a live ball is always in possession of a team and must be either in player possession or loose. This point isn't trivial when you consider that downs that include more than one play could present complications such as illegal touching, illegal batting, fouls during a loose ball, fouls during a kick, among many others. The Reading Guide offers the following interesting contrast between the football notion of possession and that of basketball. In the basketball world, possession is very simple. The ball always belongs to the opponents of the team that caused the ball to go out of bounds. In football, there is no such blanket declaration. In fact, in most cases, the opposite is true. The ball belongs to the team that had team possession when the ball went out of bounds. The study guide then lists highlights of football possession rules when a loose ball goes out of bounds. This information is relevant to discussing scrimmage requirements because provisions vary on where the ball should be spotted laterally after penalty enforcements or after a legal kick. Do you know when a coach may choose where the ball is located laterally for the next play? Well, here are the highlights from the chapter. Fumbles going forward belong to the fumbling team at the end of the run. Fumbles going backward belong to the fumbling team at the out-of-bounds spot. Backward passes belong to the fumbling team at the out-of-bounds spot. Fumbles or passes with simultaneous possession belong to the team last in possession. A loose ball in the end zone from a fumble or backward pass is a safety or a touchback. A free kick untouched by Team B belongs to Team B at the nearest hash mark at the out-of-bounds spot. A punt untouched by Team B belongs to Team B at the nearest hash mark at the out-of-bounds spot. No doubt you're aware that there is some discussion among fans and media influencers that the touchback rule should be changed for a fumble by a Team A ball carrier in the field of play that goes out of bounds in the end zone. Perhaps that discussion will gain momentum. Perhaps not. Okay, so for scrimmage requirements, here are the Team A marching orders. Here are the highlights as I see them for Chapter 4's discussion of the 7 components of Team A's scrimmage requirements. Concerning the snapper, this is covered on pages 36 to 37 in the study guide. I used to pay scant attention to the technicalities concerning the snapper until a game a year ago. During my pre-game on-field meeting with the visiting coach, he vigorously lobbied my umpire and me to allow his snapper to turn the football essentially vertical in preparation for snapping it. His team had been penalized by crews from several TASO chapters previously. In fact, he produced a laminated card with the text of a rule to argue his point. I believe the rule he cited was 2:18:1, concerning the exception that allows the snapper to be in the neutral zone. Well, I've never felt so unprepared and stumped about how to say something that sounded reasonable. I had never before been engaged by a coach about this issue. I mumbled stuff about establishing the neutral zone, maintaining a team's line of scrimmage, and other extemporaneous guesses about what provisions actually apply. When we finished the meeting after making scant progress, I knew we already had a pretty upset head coach before we even kicked off. We had a lengthy discussion in the locker room, frantically looking at the citation on the coach's laminated card and just as frantically searching the rules book for additional places where we could find clarification. By our game the next week, I had made myself an expert on the matter. Well, here are the relevant rules. Indeed, 2:18:1, which concerns encroachment and offside, applies tangentially. The coach's argument that night was essentially that the snapper is not required to maintain the neutral zone, contrary to the lame argument that I had suggested. The only flaw in the coach's argument is the rule he chose to make his laminated card for. Rule 218.1 indeed addresses what the snapper may do, but only in relation to being in the neutral zone. The exception in 218.1 allows the snapper to be in that zone as long as he is not beyond it. The coach insisted that his snapper kept the ball far enough in front of him that his head would not be in advance of the ball, even held essentially in a vertical orientation. The rule the coach should have laminated is actually the previous one, 217.1, concerning the definition of the neutral zone. Item A provides that the zone is the, quote, space between the two scrimmage lines extended to the sidelines, end quote. Item B is the clearly relevant citation. Quote, the neutral zone is established when the ball is ready for play and is resting on the ground with its long axis at right angles to the scrimmage line and parallel to the sidelines, end quote. There is no mention that any subsequent movement of the ball changes or reduces the neutral zone. Once the neutral zone is established, it's established. The snapper can do just about anything he wants to do other than lift the ball or move it forward. Thankfully, I found the provision in 217.1b before we left the locker room for the opening kickoff, so I felt very relieved to offer a face-saving compromise for him and me when I briefly engaged him before the opening kickoff. I offered a perfunctory warning that he should advise his snapper to watch out for where his head was before he snapped the ball. Otherwise, we would leave his snapper alone. We kicked off with a much calmer visiting coach, and the game moved along without incident. After the game, I learned even more of the story relevant to what a snapper can do with the ball when I found 223.1 concerning snapping the ball. I recommend you consult that rule to find two very valuable provisions for you to note should you ever need to. Provision D reads, quote, while resting on the ground and before the snap, the long axis of the ball must be at right angles to the scrimmage line, end quote. Okay. Provision E adds that, quote, unless moved in a backward direction, the movement of the ball does not start a legal snap, end quote. Indeed, Chapter 4 says essentially this very thing quite concisely. I quote the chapter. The snapper may make certain preliminary adjustments without moving the location of the ball, but he is not allowed to move the ball forward, lift it, or fail to keep the long axis of the ball perpendicular to the line of scrimmage. He may lift the ball only for lateral rotation, tilt it to a 90-degree angle, or take his hands off the ball as long as he does so smoothly and slowly, end quote. The citation the chapter presents for this is 713A. The moral of the story is to identify for yourself areas of the rules that you tend to ignore or gloss over because you're familiar with the concept and or you have never run into a situation in which you've had to answer some question or respond to some objection concerning that topic. I will never be caught off guard again about what a snapper can do. I should also add that you should review related provisions about when a snapper has become ineligible to change to another position or when shifts or motion or formations become an issue because the snapper has addressed the ball. Those too can present sticky situations that could be difficult to explain if you haven't refreshed yourself on those details in a while. So the next topic then, encroachment. This is covered on page 37 of the guide. Remind yourself of these three not-so-minor technicalities. Encroachment applies only to the offense and only after the ready for play and or the snapper touches or simulates touching the ball. Offside applies only to the defense. Encroachment is a dead ball foul. My crew had a bad moment last year when, on a fourth down play, we had a flag for encroachment but allowed the play to continue, and the foul was reported to me as offside, not encroachment. Confusion ensued about which team fouled and whether the play should stand. And finally, encroachment does not include substitutes or replaced players entering and leaving the field. Okay, next topic, false starts, pages 37 to 38. Remind yourself of these not-so-minor technicalities. Not all false starts are created equal. Chapter 4 notes that determining whether an offensive player has false started depends on the player's position as an interior lineman, the snapper, or a back. A lineman, whether interior or not, numbered 50 through 79 during scrimmage plays, and perhaps numbered otherwise during scrimmage kick plays, may not lift a hand or make a quick movement, nor be called off the line. However, a back numbered 50 through 79 is not restricted in the same way. If he lines up as an end, the prohibition remains. A Team A player positioned neither on the line nor in the backfield, what Dotson Lewis famously refers to as a mugwump, is restricted if he is positioned inside the widest lineman. Open to interpretation is whether a player is in no man's land or whether a player clearly is in the backfield has false started. Should we rule a mugwump is on the line or in the backfield based on our read of where he likely intends to be? Should we tolerate a back who goes in motion with a sudden step forward before he turns to move parallel to the neutral zone? Should we tolerate the quarterback who steps forward just prior to the snap? These are questions to be answered with the help of experience and perhaps the rules book's Part 2, Officiating Standards. Next topic, shifts, page 39. We must be sure we know what a shift is and when it ends. Chapter 4 notes that a shift occurs when two or more Team A players are moving, and it ends when all Team A players have been motionless for 1 full second. Otherwise, the shift continues if one or more players starts to move before the end of the 1 second interval. The 1 second restriction applies only to shifts, not to motion by one player. Because before the ball is snapped, there can still be a 1 second pause by all players. An illegal shift is always a live ball foul with one major exception. After the ball is ready for play, there must have been a 1 second interval when all Team A players were set before the snap. If Team A never does so, such as coming out of the huddle with 10 players setting and one going in motion, the offense has committed an illegal shift foul that, quote, converts to a false start, end quote, which means it is a dead ball foul. Even though the snap occurs, we must immediately shut the play down and penalize for a false start, not for an illegal shift. Again, you must rely on your experience and perhaps on the explicit statements of officiating standards to help you decide whether a pause meets the 1 full second threshold required by rule. Next topic, formations and numbering, pages 39 to 40. Did you know there are, by rule, 3 types of offensive formations, at least broadly speaking? Scrimmage, scrimmage kick, and free kick formations. And do you know where you find this out? You will not find these 3 terms among the definitions in Rule 2. Instead, each is defined separately. Chapter 4 references scrimmage formation as 714A, kick formation as 21610, and free kick formation as 612. Let's take them in turn. Rule 7 spells out, quote, offensive team requirements at the snap, end quote, in considerable detail in Section 4, although you will find the fundamental scrimmage requirements for number of players, for positioning of players, and for numbering of players as soon as you open the rules book under general provisions in Rule 111, which Chapter 4 does not reference. Rule 714 addresses requirements for formations. Positioning. For a scrimmage formation, all players must be in bounds, either linemen or backs, at least 5 linemen numbered 50 through 79, no more than 4 backs. For a scrimmage kick formation, there are 3 exceptions. Motioning. In either formation, 1 back may be in motion, but not start from a lineman's position nor violate the 1-second pause rule after a shift. And shifting in either formation, all players must satisfy the requirements concerning shifts and false starts in 712. I have 2 comments to share here. First comment, here's a bit of history. The positioning requirements used to include a provision that there must be at least 7 players on the line. Old-timers like me can tell you that there was a mechanics debate about whether before each down, wingmen should count linemen or count backs. The count backs camp, which is the one I've always belonged to, argued that it was a lot easier to count to 4 than to 7. Not to mention, it was a lot easier to see 4 backs than to see 7 linemen. The count lineman camp, which came along several years after my rookie days, addressed the seeing and counting issues by having each wing official count only the lineman on his side of the snapper. If the formation was unbalanced, with a so-called extra lineman on one side, the wings were supposed to communicate that with each other. The wing whose side had the shortage of one lineman would put his hand to the side of his face and point to the wing on the other side. The wing whose side had the surplus of one lineman would acknowledge the weak side wing by tapping the bill of his cap. I never understood why a crew would use such a complicated procedure with many potential points of failure built in. In addition, I found that many officials, especially newer ones, used this procedure robotically. They simply counted their 2 or 3 interior linemen without surveying and understanding the full formation. For them, the formation ended at the snapper. Whatever stuff there was beyond that was not on their radar. In those days, my primary position was linesman, and if the line judge for that game was from the count lineman camp, we often had communication issues. And many times, when I was working the referee position in subvarsity games, and I suspected a team was in an illegal formation, there was no flag from either wing. If I asked them whether there were 5 in the backfield, I usually got the Sergeant Schultz reply. All I know is that I had X many linemen on my side. So even though the wings were supposedly counting linemen, they couldn't or didn't figure out when they were short of one. There was one more important potential source of error. If Team A had 10 players in its formation, it might have 4 in the backfield, but of course only 6 on the line. So it was critically important for the wings to do their player counting on every down. The mechanics protocol at the time was that each wing counted the number of players for the team on his sideline. In practice, the referee and umpire counted offense, and the line judge counted defense. If the referee and umpire knew Team A had snapped with 10 players in formation, the referee knew to check with the line judge about how many backs he counted. If the line judge was focused on counting linemen, he often didn't know. Be aware, if you're a younger official, that you may find yourself working, especially in a middle school game, with a dinosaur who was in the count lineman camp. Now you know why he may do some odd stuff. Be aware, too, if you're younger, that you should not let my rambling digression confuse you about current scrimmage requirements. Thankfully, the requirement to have 7 linemen changed many years ago. The only hard requirement concerning positioning is that there be no more than 4 players in the backfield. Second comment: give particular attention to studying the provisions in 714A5 concerning the scrimmage kick formation exception to 50 to 79 numbering. There are 2 critical requirements that are easy to miss if teams employ a swinging gait or other motion and formation choreography. Once the snapper is established, 1. Numbering exception players must be on the line, but not on the end of the line. And 2, they remain ineligible receivers unless a forward pass touches a Team B player or an official. Topic: substitutions, pages 40 to 41. The requirements in 713B for substitutes, as well as players from the previous down, to have been between the 9-yard marks is clearly intended to prevent hideout plays. In practice, we tend to tolerate some latitude in strictly enforcing this requirement if it's obvious that the defense is aware of and accounting for a player on the periphery of the formation. In this era of speedy play and frequent substitution, the more relevant provisions for us are in Section 5 of Rule 3, devoted to substitutions. Study thoroughly the procedure for holding up the snap to allow Team B to respond to substitutions by Team A. However, understand as well what Team B's responsibilities are to make expeditious adjustments while we're holding up play. Understand, too, what the fouls are, whether they're live or dead ball fouls for teams A and B, and know the meaning and implications in 227, Articles 9, 10, and 11 of the player status terms player vacancy, replaced player, and substitute. Topic: motion, pages 41 to 42. The previous topics concerning false starts, shifts, and formations have already largely addressed the topic of motion, but it's worth mentioning a relatively obscure aspect of provisions concerning which players may go in motion. What happens when there's a situation with a mugwump? In its discussion of false starts, Chapter 4 notes that a player in so-called no man's land, but positioned outside the end, is not restricted the way interior linemen are. Does this exception apply as well to whether a mugwump is restricted from going in motion? The answer is in the companion examples 4-24 and 4-25. Quote, example 4-24. As Team A lines up for a scrimmage play, A45 is in a 3-point stance, is the widest player on his side, and is positioned so that he is neither on the line nor in the backfield. Before the snap, he slowly goes in motion and is moving toward his own goal line when the ball is snapped. Ruling: legal play. Team A's originally illegal formation was negated when A45 went in motion, and he is allowed to go in motion because he did not start from the line. That's on page 42, end quote. The critical difference in example 4-25 is that A45 is a mugwump in a 3-point stance in the slot between the tackle and split end. So the ruling is different. Quote, false start. A45 is restricted and may not change position after placing his hand on the ground or near the ground. End quote. Page 42. May I add, however, an observation? If you have reason to suspect that A45 is intentionally setting up in no man's land, very wide in the formation, to confuse the defense's coverage, is there any action you should take? I propose 2 options. Suppose A45 does not assume a three-point stance, so he looks very much like a typical eligible wide receiver. That alone might be enough to trigger your suspicion. If he does not go in motion, you could choose to be very strict about ruling A45 to be in no man's land and, at the snap, drop a flag for an illegal formation. If A45 does go in motion, you could choose to make a looser ruling that he was initially on the line. So he went in motion from a lineman's position without stopping to first establish himself as a back, eligible to go in motion. At the snap, you could drop a flag for illegal motion. If you chose a strict application of formation requirements in the first circumstance to rule an illegal formation, you'd be within the spirit of the NCAA officiating standard number 9 in Section 2. Quote, formations during the execution of a trick or unusual play have the highest degree of scrutiny and should be completely legal. End quote. On page 40, the Reading Study Guide explains what the no man's land is. It says, quote, there is a sort of no man's land that is the region between two vertical planes, the waist of the snapper and the waist of the nearest lineman. Anyone other than the quarterback in this in-between region when the ball is snapped makes the formation illegal. End quote. And to clarify further, the Reading Study Guide notes on page 54 that, except for the quarterback, no player in no man's land is an eligible pass receiver. We'll talk extensively about eligibility to catch a pass in next week's episode covering Chapter 5. All right, that's it for the topics for Team A's marching orders. Here are the marching orders for Team B. As we know, there are very few restrictions on Team B before the snap, but that doesn't mean they're not important to recognize, particularly in short yardage situations on third or fourth down. Chapter 4 addresses 4 topics relevant to Team B's restrictions: touching, disconcerting, feigning, and aligning. Topic touching on page 42. We know that Team B players may not touch the ball or Team A players until the snap. We also know that what can get us into trouble is determining whether Team A induced the contact and whether otherwise inadvertent contact is in fact a personal foul, a chance for a cheap shot that Team B couldn't resist. Topic disconcerting, page 42. We also know that Team B players may not employ, quote, disconcerting signals, end quote, that simulate the, quote, sound or cadence, end quote, of Team A's snap count. That's in 715A5. What may be less familiar for us is that restrictions on defensive signals don't commence until there's a snap count to interfere with. Therefore, example 4-27 is a bit of a surprise for me. It reads, quote, as Team A players are taking their positions on the line, B57 imitates the quarterback's cadence used previously. Ruling, not a foul at that time. Once Team A players are set and the quarterback is trying to call signals, it would be a dead ball foul if B57 continued to imitate the cadence. The defense is also restricted from clapping that's designed to simulate the offense's cadence. Topic feigning, pages 43 to 44. Closely related to disconcerting behavior is abrupt or exaggerated actions by stationary defensive players within 1 yard of the line of scrimmage intended to induce a false start. Such activity is called stemming, and it has been on the rise in recent years. It's instructive to compare the adjectives in the language of the rules concerning false starts and illegal stemming. Team A may not make, quote, quick, jerky, end quote, movements. Team B may not make, quote, quick, abrupt, or exaggerated, end quote, movements. I believe it's generally true that a Team A player false starts by accident. A Team B player stems by design. And that's why it's a tougher call for us to identify stemming than for us to recognize a false start. The pervasive intrusion in recent years of attempts by defenses to use stemming as a tactic for disrupting offenses has become troubling, and that seems to be the rationale behind recent emphasis on recognizing and penalizing stemming quickly. One delay of game penalty against Team B, rather than a false start against Team A, early in the game, typically goes a long way to cleaning up such behavior. If you want to hear more detail about stemming and false starts, I recommend episode 19 of this podcast, dated October 25th, 2023, which contrasted false starts with stemming. Final topic for Team B, aligning, on page 44. In the interest of safety for players on offense who are essentially defenseless during scrimmage kick plays, restrictions have been added recently concerning how defensive players may position themselves. We know it's illegal for a defensive player within 1 yard of the neutral zone to contact the snapper within 1 second, but it's also illegal for him to fail to align completely outside the frame of the snapper's body. What we may be less aware of is that before the snap for a place kick, it is illegal for 3 Team B players on the line of scrimmage to align shoulder to shoulder and move forward together after the snap with primary contact against a single Team A player. Whew, that's a mouthful, but that's the rule. 6314B. And of course, there is the UIL specific rule introduced last year that requires defensive players on the line of scrimmage in a 3-point stance to delay 1 second before contacting a Team A lineman. It's important to understand that fouls for aligning illegally are penalized 5 yards, while fouls for illegally contacting are penalized 15 yards. The difference is between proceeding illegally versus contacting illegally. So, a closing word. I think the length of this episode confirms that there's more than meets the eye concerning scrimmage requirements. We see so many of these downs in such rapid sequence that it's easy for us to grow complacent, perhaps even lazy or bored about calling this seemingly routine action during a game. We must discipline our study habits to honestly assess what we know, what we don't know, and what we don't know we need to know. I hope you'll make time to listen to next week's episode for discussion of Chapter 5 of the Reading Study Guide, covering the passing game. Remember, I'm a member of the Austin Football Officials Association, and we're open for new applicants right now. Our extensive training in the classroom, through Zoom, and with on-field experience in 4 locations around the greater Austin area begins next week. If you'd like to learn more about us, contact us. You can email us at recruiting@afoa.ws, visit our website at www.austinfootballofficials.org, call us at 512-298-2987, or on your favorite social media platform, use one of these hashtags. Hashtag TXHSFB, greatness, workout, awesome, and tradition. Until next time, have a great week.